They ran at first. There's no use pretending otherwise. It began with a sound more than a sight. A deep metallic thunder rolling through the narrow cuts of the Tunisian mountains, vibrating through bone and breath before the tanks themselves appeared. The earth shook as if it were alive and angry, and the men who felt it for the first time froze where they stood, rifles clutched too tightly, eyes searching the ridgelines for something they could not yet understand. Dust rose in choking clouds, turning the winter sun into a dull, sickly disk, and somewhere inside that wall of noise and sand, the Afrika Korps was coming. Most of the Americans at Kasserine Pass were young, painfully young, farm boys from Iowa, factory hands from Detroit, clerks who had traded ledgers for helmets barely months earlier. Their uniforms were still stiff, their boots not yet molded to their feet. They had trained for war, talked about war, imagined war, but nothing in the manuals or the shouting. Drills back home had prepared them for the sudden, overwhelming violence of this moment. The desert did not ease them in. It struck like a hammer. Orders came down the line, confused and contradictory, carried by runners who arrived breathless or not at all. Radios crackled with panic and then went silent. Officers scanned maps that no longer matched reality, their fingers tracing roads that were now blocked by fire and steel. The pass itself, a narrow corridor between rugged hills, felt like a trap closing from both ends. German artillery found its range quickly. Shells screaming overhead before slamming into the rocky ground, sending shards of stone spinning like knives. Men dove for cover where there was little to be found. Then the tanks appeared, grey shapes pushing through the dust, methodical and unstoppable. To the Germans it was a practiced maneuver, a familiar dance of armor and infantry refined over years of war. To the Americans, it looked like the end of the world rolling toward them on steel tracks. Anti-tank guns fired and missed or jammed or were knocked out in seconds. When rounds did hit, they often bounced off harmlessly, leaving only sparks and disbelief behind. Fear spread faster than any order. It crept into throats, tightened chests, clouded judgment. One position collapsed, then another, and suddenly men were moving backward without remembering the decision to do so. Someone shouted to fall back, someone else screamed that they were being flanked. A truck roared past, overloaded with soldiers clinging to the sides, faces pale beneath layers of dust. Rifles were dropped, helmets abandoned, gear scattered along the rocky paths like shed skin. Yet even in that chaos, moments stood out, small, sharp fragments of humanity. A medic dragged a wounded man behind a boulder, ignoring the shells bursting nearby. A lieutenant stood up, waving his arms, trying desperately to form a line that dissolved as quickly as it appeared. Two friends crouched together, one praying aloud, the other staring silently. At the approaching tanks, his jaw clenched so hard it trembled. Above it all, somewhere far from the smoke and confusion, Erwin Rommel observed. The Desert Fox had seen armies rise and fall across Europe and Africa, and he watched the Americans now with a calculating eye. To him, this was confirmation of what he already believed. They lacked experience. They lacked cohesion. They lacked the instinct that only years of war could give. Their retreat seemed to prove it. He pressed the attack, confident that one decisive blow would be enough to shatter them completely. But what Rommel could not hear over the engines and gunfire were the thoughts forming inside the minds of the men pulling back through the pass. Shame burned hotter than fear. Every step backward felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of the flag sewn onto their sleeves. They saw the looks on one another's faces, wide-eyed, stunned, furious, and something raw began to take shape. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not how they wanted it to end. As night approached, the battlefield grew eerily quiet in places, broken only by distant explosions and the groans of the wounded. Fires burned where vehicles had been hit, casting flickering light over abandoned equipment. The air smelled of cordite, oil, and blood. Units that had gone into the pass together now emerged scattered and incomplete, assembling in rough clusters wherever they could find a moment's safety. Roll calls revealed gaps that no one wanted to count too closely. In those makeshift camps, exhaustion settled in like a heavy blanket. Men sat with their backs against rocks or trucks, staring into nothing, replaying the day in their minds. Some cursed their officers, some cursed themselves, some said nothing at all. Letters from home, folded and reread 100 times, were pulled from pockets and tucked away again. The desert night grew cold, and the stars overhead felt cruelly indifferent. And yet, beneath the fatigue and humiliation, something stubborn refused to die. Conversations started quietly, then grew more intense. What went wrong? Why hadn't the guns been where they were needed? Why hadn't the orders made sense? These were not excuses, they were questions, and questions carried the seed of change. Men listened more closely now, they watched more carefully. They remembered the sound of the tanks, the timing of the artillery, the way the Germans moved with purpose instead of panic. They had been beaten, yes, but they were alive, and the living, especially the angry and embarrassed, have a dangerous habit of adapting. Rommel believed he had seen the Americans' true face at Kasserine Pass. He believed their retreat revealed a weakness that could be exploited again and again. But down in the dust, among the men who had run and hated themselves for it, a quieter truth was forming. The desert had stripped away their illusions in a single brutal day, leaving behind something far more useful than confidence, resolve forged in failure. They did not know it yet, sitting there under the cold North African sky, but this moment the fear, retreat, the bitter taste of defeat would follow them into every battle that came after. It would whisper to them when shells fell close, remind them what happened when confusion ruled, and push them to stand when instinct screamed to run. Kasserine Pass was not just a loss, it was a beginning written in dust and fire, waiting for its meaning to be claimed. They did not break, they learned. Though learning came slowly and painfully measured, not in classroom hours, but in sleepless nights and hard, humiliating conversation. In the days after Kasserine Pass, the American camps were quieter than they had ever been. Laughter was rare, bravado vanished. Men spoke in low voices if they spoke at all, and when they did, it was about what they had seen and what they had failed to do. The desert, vast and unforgiving, seemed to watch them, waiting to see whether they would remain what Rommel believed them to be, or become something else entirely. The first changes were subtle. Officers stopped pretending they had all the answers. Maps were spread out again and again, annotated with fresh scars of memory. Terrain that had once seemed abstract lines and symbols on paper now carried meaning. This ridge had concealed enemy guns. That valley funneled armor like a slaughter chute. The pass itself was no longer just a name. It was a lesson written in fear and smoke. Every mistake was dissected, not to assign blame, but to ensure it would never happen the same way twice. Then the changes grew sharper. Commanders who had frozen under pressure were removed, their authority quietly reassigned. In their place came men who had already learned, sometimes the hard way, how modern war worked. Among them was a stern, unyielding general who believed discipline was not cruelty but survival. His presence was felt immediately. Orders were clear, or they were rewritten. Confusion was no longer tolerated. Training intensified, not with comforting speeches, but with relentless repetition. Drill followed drill, until muscle memory replaced hesitation. The men felt it in their bones. They marched farther, faster, under heavier loads. They dug deeper foxholes, learned to camouflage vehicles until they vanished into the desert, practiced setting up and tearing down gun positions with ruthless efficiency. Artillery units drilled until they could bring fire down within minutes instead of hours. Tank crews learned to coordinate with infantry, not charge ahead blindly. Radios were checked, rechecked, and guarded like lifelines, because now everyone understood what silence had cost them before. The desert itself became their harsh instructor. The Americans learned how sound carried differently in open terrain, how dust could reveal movement from miles away, how the heat punished carelessness and rewarded preparation. They learned to conserve water without weakening, to to move at night when possible, to respect the enemy's skill instead of underestimating it. Gone was the illusion that enthusiasm alone could win battles. In its place grew a sober, dangerous competence. Morale, oddly enough, began to rise not because things were easy, but because they were finally making sense. Men trusted one another more. They trusted their units. They trusted that when the next attack came, it would not be chaos, layered on chaos. Letters home changed in tone. Where once there had been casual optimism, now there was determination. We got hit hard, some wrote, but we're getting better. They did not boast. They didn't need to. When they returned to combat, the difference was immediate and unmistakable. The Germans attacked, expecting the same panicked resistance, the same rapid collapse. Instead, they met coordinated fire. American artillery responded swiftly, shells landing with accuracy that surprised even their own crews. Infantry held positions longer, falling back only when ordered, covering one another with disciplined bursts of fire. Tanks maneuvered with purpose, no longer isolated targets but part of a larger plan. For the first time, the Americans felt the shift themselves. Fear was still there, it always would be, but it no longer ruled them. They had faced it before and survived. They knew its shape now. When shells burst nearby, men flinched, then steadied. When German armor appeared, anti-tank crews waited, hearts pounding, until the range was right. Shots struck true more often than not. Each small success fed the next. Rommel noticed. He was not a man prone to sentiment, but he was a keen observer, and what he saw unsettled him. These were not the same troops he had brushed aside at Kasserine. Their reactions were faster, their defenses more layered. Their counterattacks, though limited, were sharp and well-timed. The Americans were still learning, still imperfect, but they were learning at a speed that demanded respect. The fighting wore on, grinding and relentless. Casualties mounted, and each loss was felt deeply. But now, instead of shattering units, those losses hardened them. Men stepped into fallen comrades' roles without hesitation. Leadership emerged from unexpected places: a sergeant who kept his squad together under fire, a gunner who refused to abandon his post despite wounds, a runner who crossed open ground again and again to keep lines of communication alive. These acts were not dramatic in the way movies would later portray them. They were quiet, grim, and essential. Between engagements, there was little rest. Repairs were made under fire. Plans were adjusted. Intelligence was shared instead of hoarded. Allied coordination improved. Lessons exchanged with British units who had been fighting the Afrika Korps for years. Pride was swallowed in favor of survival. The Americans listened, absorbed, adapted. Every day they became less predictable, less vulnerable. The desert battles were no longer one-sided. German advances slowed, then stalled. Supplies grew harder to move under constant pressure. The Americans, once reactive, began to dictate the tempo in small but meaningful ways. A delayed column here, a disrupted attack there. Each success chipped away at the myth of invincibility that had surrounded Rommel's forces for so long. And with every stand, every hard-earned gain, the memory of Kasserine Pass loomed in the background, not as a wound, but as a warning. Men remembered what happened when they underestimated the enemy, when they trusted luck over preparation. That memory kept them alert, disciplined, and unforgiving of their own mistakes. They had entered North Africa as amateurs and been bloodied for it. Now, forged by defeat and relentless effort, they were becoming professionals. Rommel had expected fear to finish them. Instead, fear had taught them. And in war, a force that can learn faster than its enemy is already on the path to victory. By the time the guns began to fall silent across North Africa, the change was impossible to ignore, not just to historians looking back, but to the men who had lived it. Step by brutal step. The Americans who now stood in the desert were not the same ones who had stumbled through Kasserine Pass months earlier. Their faces were leaner, their eyes harder, their movements purposeful. War had stripped away the last traces of innocence and replaced them with something far more dangerous. Confidence earned the hard way. The final engagements were not dramatic flashes of sudden triumph. They were grinding, methodical, relentless. Advances measured in yards, not miles. Positions taken, lost, and taken again. The Americans moved forward with patience, supported by artillery that spoke with deadly precision and infantry that understood how to survive under fire. Coordination, once their greatest weakness, had become a strength. Tanks no longer charged blindly. They advanced with infantry at their sides, guns covering likely ambush points, radios alive with constant communication. Rommel felt the pressure closing in. He had fought across deserts and mountains, outmaneuvered larger forces, and earned his legend through speed and audacity. But now the space he relied on was shrinking, and the enemy pressing him was learning too quickly for comfort. Reports from the front painted a picture he did not like. American units holding firm, counter-attacking with confidence, refusing to collapse, even under heavy blows. They were no longer predictable. They were no longer fragile. Supplies became a constant concern. Every mile forward stretched German logistics thinner, while Allied air power harassed convoys relentlessly. The Americans, once plagued by shortages and inefficiency, now benefited from a growing, well-organized supply network. Ammunition arrived when needed. Fuel flowed. Replacements came trained and better prepared. The machine behind the men was finally working as it should. And on the battlefield, that mattered as much as courage. For the soldiers themselves, the sense of momentum was unmistakable. Each successful action reinforced the belief that they belonged here, that they could stand against one of the most feared commanders in the world and win. The shame of Kasserine had not been forgotten, it had been transformed. It lived on as a reminder, a quiet voice that urged caution, preparation, and unity. It reminded them what happened when they underestimated war. There were moments, in brief lulls between fighting, when men allowed themselves to reflect. Sitting in foxholes, cleaning weapons worn smooth by constant use, they talked about how far they had come. Some laughed at their own early mistakes, shaking their heads at how green they had been. Others spoke of friends who hadn't made it this far, their names carried forward in memory and purpose. Victory, when it came, would belong to them too. As Axis resistance weakened, the Americans pushed forward with increasing assurance. Towns and strongpoints fell one by one. Each success was met not with wild celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement and immediate preparation for the next task. They had learned that complacency killed. Discipline had become habit, and habit had become identity. Rommel, ever the realist beneath the myth, understood what this meant. He had misjudged the Americans, not their resources, but their capacity to adapt. He had seen them at their worst, and assumed that was their limit. He had not accounted for the way defeat could sharpen resolve instead of destroying it. In his calculations, he had underestimated time itself, the time it gave an army to learn, to reorganize, to harden. When the campaign in North Africa finally came to an end, it was clear that a turning point had been reached. The Americans had not merely participated, they had proven themselves. Commanders trusted their units, allies trusted their commitment, enemies respected their strength. The battlefield had delivered its verdict, and it was final. But the true significance of what happened there went beyond maps and surrender line. North Africa became the foundation upon which everything else was built. The men who had learned under fire would carry those lessons into Sicily, into Italy, onto the beaches of Normandy. They would train others, lead others, and face even greater challenges with the knowledge that they could endure and overcome. Kasserine Pass, once spoken of in embarrassed tones, took on new meaning. It was no longer just a defeat, it was the crucible. It was the place where illusion died and competence was born, where fear was faced, studied, and mastered, where an army discovered that courage alone was not enough, but courage guided by discipline could change the course of history. In the end, the Americans did not need Rommel's acknowledgement to validate their transformation. The evidence was written across battlefields, in the quiet confidence of seasoned soldiers and the steady advance of Allied forces. But history would note it all the same, the moment when a young, untested army was bloodied, learned, and rose stronger than before. They proved Rommel wrong not with words, but with endurance, not with bravado, but with growth. And as the war moved on and the world held its breath for what came next, one truth stood unshakable out of defeat in the dust of Kasserine Pass. An eye had been forged that would help decide the fate of a world.